All right, let's talk about Ukraine. Let's go ahead and put this up there on the screen. This is something that we've been warning about from the very beginning and finally beginning to come true. The European Union and NATO governments are now sounding alarm over arms smuggling from Ukraine into Europe as governments fret over billions of weapons sent to Kyiv are ending up after they cross the border. And I think this is a very important piece because it's something that we really were trying to warn about from the beginning, which is that what you can see is that the billions of dollars in weapons that we're sending to Ukraine, now, of course, we're sending them to the Ukrainian military, but the Ukrainian military is not just a whole organization. We found this out the hard way in the Afghan military. There are many different composite parts. Sometimes there's not good people who are in there. And sometimes they're willing to accept cash from really shady people and just sell them elsewhere and then come back to the US and say, hey, by the way, we used all those weapons. We need even more weapons. And what they point to is that initially Ukrainian officials actually maintained a register of the firearms who were handed out to civilian. But the practice was abandoned as the war progressed and firearms have been distributed without records since then. And there is no currently real register of any of these weapons the moment that they end up in Ukraine. So the way that the, kind of possession process works is NATO and the US, we take the weapons there, we scan them, we have good records, obviously, and we hand them over. Well, the moment that they get on a truck in Ukraine and go wherever the hell they're supposed to go, nobody knows. Yeah. And from that point, we have seen this happen in Libya. We saw it happen in Syria. We saw it happen in Afghanistan. We saw how Libyan and Syrian weapons had a all across all sorts of crazy conflicts. I mean, don't forget, this stuff can bleed back, even when it was Syria. For example, remember those Paris attacks? I mean, a lot of that was organized in ISIS territory in Syria, the training, the planning. So a vacuum of power with an influx of weapons has never worked out for modern Western policy, except this one is actually on the European continent. So you could see very sophisticated weapons and weapon systems ending up in the hands of all sorts of crazy people with cash. There's Chechen separatists. There's, we've got the Dagestanis, who are also in Russia. There's no shortage of separatist groups in Western Europe and militias elsewhere. And all these people would love to get their hands on some brand new weapons from the United States or from NATO. And that's exactly what they're warning about in this piece.
Yeah, they say, they quote a Western official who says, all these weapons land in southern Poland, get shipped to the border, and then are just divided up into vehicles to cross, trucks, vans, sometimes private cars. And from that moment on, we go blank on their location, and we have no idea where they go, where they are used, or even if they stay in the country. You'll recall that the last massive authorization of spending that passed through Congress, I think it was Rand Paul who said, hey, let's have some accountability along with this. How about we track and, make sure we're keeping account of where these weapons go and who they end up with, et cetera. Got voted down. They said no. And that's exactly the problem when you have just a total blank check is, they can sell off some of these weapons. They can go into the black market. They can make some cash and they can just come back to their American patrons and say, oh, we use those. We need more.
And maybe it's not Zelensky. He wouldn't even know about it.
I'm not putting this
That's what I'm saying.
Zelensky.
Listen.
Ukraine was not a well-run country. Let's not have any illusions about Ukraine being some really super efficient and non-corrupt nation before any of this happened. It was not. I mean, it ranks very poorly on measures of corruption. So there are a lot of holes in the system through which anything can slip.
We literally just saw this whole story play out in Afghanistan. I mean, I've told some stories here before about how the Afghan military kept requisitioning all this gas. And the military commander's like, how are they using all this gas for the Humvees? They were like, oh, they didn't use them at all. They never even drove the Humvees. They sold the gas at a profit. They just took it from us and then sold it off. Take that and multiply by 700 billion. Well, now we've got 40 billion so far of what we've shipped over to Ukraine, or at the very least it's been appropriated. And just yesterday it was like 1.7 billion in additional aid that's heading over there. I'm not saying that some of the weapons that we're giving them aren't making an effect. Throw this next one up there on the screen. They've been using these new anti-aircraft systems against air defense systems in Russian territory, which have actually been very helpful. There's been a lot of jokes and memes in the military community about how the Russians, for some odd reason, store their ammunition and others in like very concentrated places, which obviously make them easier in order to hit with by the Ukrainians with U.S. supplied technology. But it also does highlight like, hey, what if one of these things gets into the wrong hands? That could be a very serious problem. And we saw the exact play out of this in the 1990s, whenever Ukraine specifically was a major shipping ground for all sorts of black market weapons all across the world. Nobody knows where the hell all of this stuff is going to end up in the future, and that exactly highlights the issue. And at the same time, our producer James has been highlighting this and pointing to it. Let's put this up there, which is that there is still a major problem right now in terms of grain exports. Remember that Ukraine was one of the world's largest shippers of grain. It's always been known as kind of one of the breadbaskets of Europe. And there's been ongoing plans right now to try and get some of this damn grain out of the Black Sea in order to alleviate some of the issues with global hunger. But that still has not been hammered out. It's not completely finalized with a deal, and it just highlights that there are major spillover effects from this conflict, which people refuse to discuss. One of the reasons that Rand Paul elsewhere, even when we were sounding alarms about this, people will be like, "Oh, you're just trying to throw kinks into." It's like, listen, we're not talking. You can still support Ukraine and learn from. It's not ancient history. It just happened. We ran this whole experiment multiple times in the 2010s, and then before that in the 1980s. It's happened over and over again, and we never learn our lesson.
Yeah.
And people call you a propagandist or whatever if you point it out. It's like, listen, we have broader interests outside of just Ukraine, but that itself is a foreign mindset to a lot of people.
Yeah, I mean, listen, of course, the worst suffering is being committed on Ukrainian soil. There's no doubt about it. The Ukrainians are the ones who are suffering the most with this whole situation. But there is a lot of suffering around the globe that is knock-on effects from this crisis, from this war, in the rising food costs, in the fact that a lot of places that really depend on Russia for fertilizer because of the banking sanctions effectively can't get it.
Yep.
So that means you not only have higher food prices, but you have a drop in crop productivity, so that countries are unable to feed themselves. They're having to try to import more grain, more basic staples of their people's diet, unable to do it, under stress from all kinds of different directions. And so you're seeing a truly historic amount of hunger and people who are struggling with famine and food insecurity. You have nations that are on edge and in crisis. I mean, the bread riots have already started in all kinds of places around the globe. As I was alluding to before, you also have nations that are being pushed closer to the brink of default on their sovereign debt. Sri Lanka already, obviously that has happened. Pakistan is another nation that has really been pushed to the edge. So this war is causing a lot of chaos around the globe. Now listen, no one here is saying that it would be easy to end, that the U.S. could snap their fingers and it could be all over. That is not the case. But our posture, our strategy has not been to even try to push for negotiations and some sort of a settlement, which is going to be very politically difficult for Zelensky. There's no doubt about it, because it seems that the bulk of the Ukrainian people believe they can win, believe that they don't have to cede any kind of territory. We should be putting pressure on our allies to try to bring this thing to the close, rather than what we've been doing, which is putting pressure on the Ukrainians to keep this thing going, because this is a disaster for the entire globe, and it is first and foremost a disaster for the Ukrainian people. Having a war, an endless war on their soil, is going to devastate this country for years and years to come.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, look, it's going to take a long time, even if we decided to pursue peace. And we all watched what happened with Syria. Syria dragged on for years and years. And the longer it went, the more weapons that were flowing per capita into that place. And go ask, people who live in Syria how that worked out for them. So Syria becoming a playground of the great powers is probably the worst thing that happened to the actual Syrians themselves. And I'm sure a lot of them would have preferred at least something in 2012 or 2013 as opposed to the bloodshed that eventually came 2015 onward.
Cable news is ripping us apart, dividing the country, making it impossible to function as a society, and making it impossible to know just what is true and what is false. But the good news is they are failing and they know it.
That is why we're building something new, a new mainstream, a healthier one, something more trustworthy, something that we are going to need in one of the most pivotal times in American history. We are building up here for the midterms, for the upcoming presidential election, but we need your help. So if you can help us out by becoming a premium member today at breakingpoints.com, we're trying to change America for the better and the entire world.
So what are you waiting for, guys? Go to breakingpoints.com and sign up and help us build a new mainstream.